On December 31st, 1999 at 11:59 p.m., I sat trembling in my room, awaiting the annihilation of the world. I closed my eyes, ready for the alien mothership to appear in the night sky, for computers to come alive and implode the very fabric of society. Y2K was going to kill us all. Mr. Jones down the street built a bunker underneath his house and told us if we didn't do the same, the first blast from the alien mothership would incinerate us. As the seconds counted down, I squeezed my eyes as hard as I could and braced myself for the alien takeover. But as the clock struck midnight, nothing happened. When I opened my eyes at 12:01 a.m., it wasn't alien motherships I saw, or computers exploding that I heard, but instead an ensemble of banging pots and pans. Doomsday, despite worldwide hysteria, turned out to be one of history's greatest flukes. I was alive. The infamous Y2K scare is one of those moments in time that felt very anticlimactic, despite the terrible thought that I was going to be burned to a crisp. At least it was something exciting. As a teenager during the 90s, I had dreams of a futuristic society by the turn of the decade. One of flying cars, robots, laser guns, and space jumping into new galaxies like I saw in Star Wars. You know, all the cool shit that you saw in movies like Independence Day and Terminator 2. I dreamed, yes I did, I dreamed about flying to Mars and waking up next to Sharon Stone after watching Total Recall. When nothing happened and the world went back to its same old boring self, I felt utterly disappointed. So I did the only thing I could. I popped in a copy of Back to the Future that I had re-recorded over my dad's VHS tape labeled Sports Illustrated Swimsuit Contest, grabbed a pack of sour warheads from my secret stash, and fell asleep shortly after reading the latest episode of EGM. When I woke up the next day, little did I know that I'd be glad Y2K didn't kill us all, because this decade would be one of, if not the best eras for video games ever. Just about everything you could possibly think of that was exciting happened in the 2000s, and this was a 10-year period where video game culture exploded like I never thought it was possible. In the 90s, video games were just getting a foothold into a society where people spent most of their time outside. I was a dork, and I had my dorky friends, and we had our GoldenEye tournaments high up in my tree fort. We pinned up a wooden sign carved "No Girls Allowed," but beyond this tree fort, our gaming garage setup, and the odd trip to the local arcade, this was my entire gaming world. But when 2000 came around, it wouldn't just be us dorks playing video games into the starry night. Games would dig their clutches into the very fabric of the world. And that is no understatement. Games and tech advanced so suddenly that it's very difficult to comprehend how fast time seemed to fly during this 10-year window. All sorts of crazy new genres began to pop up. Game design fundamentally changed given increased hardware capacity in broader markets. There were so many systems with varying features and hardware and all sorts of weird controllers, online features, and a lot of gimmicks. This was the decade of innovation. The landslide of gaming popularity began the very first year of the decade when Sony launched the PlayStation 2 in October. In the 90s, if you wanted a Nintendo 64, you could go out and buy it. You might have to visit a few stores, but if you had the cheddar, you were getting the system. But not with a PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 was the system that began the trend of having to show up at a store the day beforehand and see if people were waiting outside in line already. I know this because I actually had to camp out overnights at Walmart to get one. I shit you not, I stood next to a reeking dumpster outside the building for 18 hours to get the PlayStation 2. This was the first time I ever experienced anything like this. Truth be told, I nearly froze to death overnight like a popsicle. And food? I'd rather starve to death before leaving the line. I damn well nearly pissed myself too. Only 8 of the 60 people lined up got a system that morning. The rest left embarrassed. That's how far gaming had come in just a few short years. Video games weren't just Nintendo games anymore. The PlayStation was one of the most successful gaming consoles of all time, but you didn't have to risk getting mugged if you zonked out for a second in a shady parking lot just to get it. But when 2000 came to a close, gaming would spread through the world like a wildfire. There were several reasons for this. First, gaming had become way more than the beeps and bots of its heydays. Pong was out, high-definition 3D graphics were in, with new controllers, better performance, and online play. The most important thing was you didn't need to be a gamer to recognize and appreciate games during the 2000s, whereas you wouldn't know what the hell you were looking at if you were in the 80s and you were not a gamer. You had to have an extreme amount of imagination to play an Atari game, for example. Getting your grandma to understand what the hell was happening in this screen of Sword Quest was like trying to explain what the meaning of life was to an orangutan. In the 2000s though, people, real non-gaming people, could actually look at a TV and see the difference in video game genres now. And with new controllers and lots of new options, it was easier to play them too. Not everyone can play Ghouls and Ghosts in the 80s, but everyone could play Wii Sports in 2006. The first few months of the 2000s were simply nuts. The Dreamcast was the last system launched in the 90s, and it was incredibly underrated. It would eventually be discontinued in March of the following year, but it would deliver some amazing titles up into its demise. Just in the first 30 days of the year, the Dreamcast launched Crazy Taxi, Legacy of Kain: Soul Reaver, and what I consider the greatest Resident Evil game ever made, Code Veronica, followed by Dead or Alive 2, Rayman 2, Skies of Arcadia, Jet Set Radio, and Grandia 2, just to name a couple. Not to mention Shenmue, which had just launched 3 days before Y2K, which was one of the most hyped games ever. You want to talk about a console that was all about the games? The Dreamcast was not f***ing around. Sadly, when the PlayStation 2 hit in October, interest plummeted so hard that Sega was forced to throw in the towel, marking the end of one of the coolest game systems ever made. But not without last one hurrah, and that game was Phantasy Star Online. I can't even describe how wild it was to play an online RPG on a console on launch as a kid in 2000. It was like being in a dream. Prior to the Dreamcast, you couldn't really play games online unless you bought weird adapters like the Sega Saturn Netlink, which nobody did. It was literally the first system with a built-in modem. I had been playing a few games online for a few years now on my PC like Diablo 1, but nothing like the power of 128 bits. With the Dreamcast, you could plop yourself down on a couch and game online while scarfing down Pringles. I mean, this was avant-garde gaming at its finest. It was ghetto and slower than cows, but hey, it was real. I lost myself in games like Choo Choo Rocket, Ooga Booga, and Bomberman Online. Can you believe this is an actual race? A 4x4 Evo played on Sega Nets 23 years ago? It's insane. But nothing really compared to Phantasy Star Online. It was the first online console game that really hooked me, and I remember how surreal it was walking around town seeing actual real-life people in a console game, then walking out into the forest and gunning down monsters and watching other people do the same but with laser swords. And you could actually type to people if you had the Dreamcast keyboard. If you had the Dreamcast mouse as well, you can play Quake and Unreal Tournament online. Again, it was jank, but this is where it all started. And there's something really special about being part of a revolution, an inception, in the moment, at that time, despite how ghetto it was. The saying that you just had to have been there is real. Of course, online gaming was very niche and very pricey, because families didn't want you holding the phone line hostage, especially if the Dreamcast was in another room from the phone line, where you'd have to drag the cable across the house to connect it, essentially creating a 30-foot tripwire of death. God forbid if anyone hit that thing, they'd crash to the ground and break a hip. Eventually other consoles would catch up to the online scene, namely the Xbox. When the Xbox released in November of 2001, it would officially declare war with the PlayStation 2, which had come out 1 year before. The Xbox was pretty damn amazing, and unlike today, they actually had a lot of great first-party titles. Most importantly, it allowed for broadband connectivity and included a hard drive disk for storage, two things that crippled online play for the Dreamcast, not to mention negated the rather annoying prospect of having to insert those fat, stupid memory cards into the controller. Those things nearly gave me carpal tunnel. Many Xbox games had online functionality when they released into Xbox Live in 2002, including fighting, racing, shooting, and many off-colored game modes like Competitive Conquer or Spies vs. Mercs for Chaos Theory. This one game truly defined my year like no other. You simply don't get these types of creative online experiences today. There was even a Far Cry game called Instincts that you can play online, and a Forza game that was actually really fun. You could even play poker online with randos with World Poker Tour. One game that was also really popular was, of course, Battlefront 2 for the Xbox, where you'd have massive battles rage on into the night. And let me tell you, people were hyped as shit for this one. But the most popular game on the Xbox had to be Unreal Championship, the console version of Unreal Tournament. If you never played Quake on PC in the 90s, this was an experience to be had. To a kid who had only been playing couch co-op his whole life on console, it felt like an out-of-body experience, being able to go toe-to-toe with some random kid in Queens and know that when you teabagged him after you killed him, he absolutely saw it. But honestly, the most fun I ever had playing with other people in the 2000s wasn't online. It was System Link and LAN parties. The Xbox came with the ability to connect 4 consoles together with 4 TVs, allowing 16 players to play together at the same time. It was absolutely insane. My friends and I hosted game fests at each other's houses all the time, and we'd order pizza and soda until the cows came home. And Xbox had the best game for System Link, Halo, and we only played one game mode, which was 16-player CTF on Blood Gulch, and our battles went far into the night until our parents threatened to come downstairs and beat the shit out of us for being so loud. When the smoke cleared, we sat there drenched in sweat, hoarse to the bone from screaming, with piles of cheese breadcrumbs running down the sides of our asses. The marinara had been spilled hours ago and no one seemed to notice, and honestly, we didn't care. It wasn't our house anyway. It was just pure chaotic fun that no one ever today could understand unless you were there. And the same goes for LAN parties, where you'd have kids bring over their PCs to each other's houses and hook them up for fat battles of Warcraft 3 and Tribes 2. Dude, do you remember Tribes 2? This was my favorite futuristic jetpack team shooter, and you could LAN it with up to 128 people or bots. It was incredible. This trend of couch co-op and landing itself though wouldn't last forever. As online features became more mainstream and society became addicted to social media, Facebook, and computers, traditional co-op games became few and far between, and LANs became yearly tournaments like QuakeCon. In fact, game genres became quite specialized as the new systems migrated towards their own targeted demographics. Microsoft and Sony would be great rivals throughout the 2000s, and even to this day the feud is ongoing. They vie for the same space more or less in the gaming markets, offering modern gaming experiences with mature rated video game titles. Xbox offered more services on its online platform and more features, but content-wise you can generally find similar styles of games on both systems. It's interesting, though not peculiar, that Nintendo decided very on not to take part in the rat race and focused instead on light-hearted games like Mario, Metroid, Kirby, and Zelda. Those games are for everyone. And with interesting controller setups like the Wiimote, you'd never find violent action games, standard FPS games, or controversial titles like The Last of Us on Nintendo consoles. When most people talk about the popularity of gaming, they often say that Microsoft and Sony have the most players and that Nintendo has always been trailing behind, but that couldn't be more far from the truth in the 2000s. In fact, of the 10 top-selling games of the decade, 8 were from Nintendo, and the top 7 are all from Nintendo. The only game franchise that came close was Grand Theft Auto, and if you look at the top 30 top-selling games of the 2000s, Nintendo holds 19. The highest-selling game was Wii Sports, in fact, with 82 million units sold, which was for the time the highest selling video game ever. Eventually it would be overthrown by Minecraft and GTA 5, but during the 2000s, Nintendo was one of the top dogs, releasing 4 really great platforms: the Game Boy Advance, the GameCube, the Wii, and the Nintendo DS. I personally think the GameCube is one of the best systems to ever hit the scene. Although the GameCube fell into last place in the race, it's the most critically under-acclaimed system next to the DC. It was a little purple box of creativity with a cute handle, but at its heart, it was a pulsating volcano of awesomeness. Unlike the Wii, which was for everyone, including your grandma, the GameCube was actually still a console for hardcore gamers. With it came an interesting controller that was perfect for the new creative 3D titles it would house, predating the somewhat gimmicky era of motion controls and the shackles of capitalistic game regurgitation. The GameCube was a treasure box full of many games that have become long-standing staples in gaming culture. Just flipping through a little bit of the gold brings me back to a time where gaming was truly at its peak with some of the best Nintendo first-party titles ever made. You pretty much got everything with the Cube. All the great first-party titles, M-rated smashers like Killer 7 and Eternal Darkness, the best Paper Mario game, kart racers, really good Star Wars games, and one of the best soccer games ever made. GameCube titles truly made unimaginable things happen while nailing the design and the gameplay of their titles, and I always thought the mini discs they came on were really cute, even though the tech of the Cube was actually one of the reasons it's viewed as a commercial failure, despite being one of the best systems ever for gamers. The PS2 and the Xbox had DVD players, which at the time was very cost-effective, practical, and offered more capacity for the third-party scene, while the GameCube had a handle. It made the system look like a breadbasket. More importantly, it also had no support for online play and the perception of being less powerful, which wasn't entirely true. In the 2000s, graphics were a really big part of gaming discourse, and it was often just as important to have really good-looking titles as it was to have really good playing titles to attract buyers who were on the fence. And GameCube titles looked, on average, worse than the really pretty shiny graphics of Xbox and such. And that's a shame because I think the Nintendo GameCube was an absolute rock star of a system. Either way, Nintendo would make much more headway with the Wii in 2006, selling 5 times as many consoles as the GameCube. Another enormous trend from the 2000s was the evolution of PC gaming. By the end of the 90s, several blockbuster online games had come into the scene like StarCraft, Diablo, Warcraft 3, and several big-time RPGs and all the competitive shooters like Unreal Tournament. When Diablo 2 came out in 2000 though, it was clear that PC gaming was not just here to stay, but a force to be reckoned with. I can't even describe how much of my life I put into this one single game, just trying to find a win force, which has eluded me to this day. I wish I could have some of those hours of my life back, I was so addicted. But it wasn't just Diablo that burst into the scene. As I said before, a cornucopia of games flooded the decade, and it wasn't long before there were so many games available that you couldn't possibly play them all. In just a few short years, PC fans got Counter-Strike, Deus Ex, Knights of the Old Republic, Half-Life, Half-Life 2, Oblivion, Morrowind, Max Payne, and so many more games that are still held in high regard today. The variety was truly incredible, starting a new trend in getting games into the hands of so many different people. It wasn't just the nerds playing games anymore like the 90s. The most important game of the 2000s though was arguably The Sims. Having gotten my first PC soon after, I can say The Sims was one of the coolest and most messed up and fucked up games I've ever played. This is a game where you take control of a bunch of people as they go about their day. You start by making a house, then you have to feed your family, shower them, make friends, go to work, maintain your relationships, water your plants, invest in stocks, invite friends over, and all this other weird stuff. You can see the requirements in the bottom right of the screen. These are all the things you have to micromanage. That includes hygiene, so yes, you have to watch your character take a dump in the toilet. As a kid, this was kinda nasty. The same went for how your house could start looking like a landfill if you didn't take care of it. If you didn't take out your trash or wash your dishes, your house would start smelling like a garbage dump. And if you didn't bang your wife, she wouldn't love you anymore. Yes, you can watch your character have sex as the little pixels go humpy humpy, and if you didn't take care of your kids, Child Protective Services would show up and take them away. Again, as a kid, this was so surreal to me. You can even set your house on fire and kill everyone. It's truly one of the weirdest games I've ever seen, and I can't even believe it got made. But it got so many people into gaming during a period where just a few years beforehand, they looked down on such a media, because it was chill and required basically no skill. With just a little bit of attention, anyone can play The Sims and have a good time with it. It was approachable, understandable, and easy to use. AKA accessible, one of the trends that would alter the fortunes of gaming to this very day. These kinds of games were everywhere in the 2000s, like Roller Coaster Tycoon, but there was also tons of stuff for other types of players too. All sorts of complex simulation games like EVE Online, online shoot-em-ups, puzzlers, role-playing games, MMOs, and creative genre breakers like Guitar Hero and Dance Dance Revolution. Talk about bridging the gap between gamers and watchers. And then there were really niche titles like Black and White, which was my first God game. I'm not even sure what this game was all about. And Sacrifice was the other game that just blew my mind. Again, another new age fusion game blending combat, action, and RTS. This particular game was so fascinating to me because as a kid, I couldn't even have dreamed up a concept like this. Just to nail this point home, this was the decade that Beautiful Joe and Pikmin launched on GameCube and Okami for the PlayStation 2. There were so many weird and wonderful types of games. The 90s seemed so simple compared to all this. Like I said, it was the era of innovation. One such creative title introduced in 2000 called No One Lives Forever shows a very different side to the FPS than you'd ever find today. This era was all about taking chances, but this wouldn't last forever. Far into the next decade, more aggressive business practices encouraged copycat game development. For-profit incentives like overly monetizing titles and stuffing all sorts of in-game stores and pre-order bonuses into the mix. This was a good way to get more money for every dollar spent, but its ethics are questionable. Regardless, it's landed us where we are today, where every game seems like it's trying to shoot for the financial stars. But in the 2000s, every single genre had its day, from kart racers to 4X strategy games to Sudoku sex anime games and everything else you could think of. Though the popularity of some of those would wane as the decade went on, like beat-em-ups, point-and-clicks, and of course, the once-beloved platformer that we all know and love. And honestly, arcades too, unfortunately, would be left in the dust given the popularity and availability of consoles, online gaming, and PC gaming. By 2009, you could play a game with anyone, from anywhere, from the comfort of your own couch, have a friends list, and chat online or even voice chat, all while playing games that in no way, shape, or form are representative of today's most popular. You have to understand that during the 2000s, gaming culture wasn't anything like it is today. There weren't any MOBAs, or Battle Royale games, or Minecraft or Overwatches. Those games came in the following decade. You didn't stream, Twitch wasn't founded yet, you didn't have smartphones for games until the very end of the decade. YouTube was just starting up, and this idea of online communities among games wasn't really a thing yet. Reddit was also very new and underutilized. It was game sites like game trailers that were popular, not raging internet news tycoon YouTubers. People discussing the games industry in provocative and lucrative ways wasn't really a thing. There was no lavish monetization in gaming, no battle passes, no season passes, no loot boxes or anything like that. You might have a couple things you could buy, but all of that was yet to come. In the early days, it was more or less no drama, all fun. Several big games had giant communities though. Iconic titles like RuneScape and World of Warcraft, EverQuest 2 would pretty much take over the lives of innocent kids across the world, including myself. Counter-Strike was insanely popular, but MMOs were the most powerful games by far on PC. This iconic picture showcases the insanity, 10 million active subscribers per month at the turn of the decade. That's $150 million in revenue each month, ongoing for a decade. Can you imagine that kind of cheddar? World of Warcraft not only paved the groundworks for the modern MMO, but it changed the face of cooperative and online play forever. Not just PvP gameplay like Counter-Strike. WoW is a social game. You can talk to people to get groups, you could trade, run dungeons, do PvP, or craft and exploit the in-game economy with the auction house. All while interacting with other players in any way you wanted. Whereas games could be beaten in a single sitting in the 90s, you could essentially play WoW forever. It became the norm in the 2000s to save games and come back later to them, especially given how consoles had either internal hard drives or memory cards now. This had a large effect on the evolution of video game difficulty. But having a character in a living, breathing, ongoing world was simply on another level though. There was no end screen and you never see the words game over. You were the character and the world was yours, but it would come at a cost. World of Warcraft came with an upfront cost, plus $15 a month for your subscription. I played WoW for 10 years, which means I forked over almost $2,000 for this game. It damn near bankrupted me, and in my addiction I ended up homeless, living in a casino hotel, gambling my nights away to afford my room. This was definitely a turning point for gaming, caused primarily by the new age of subscriptions. The only other things the game had leading up to subscriptions were expansion packs, but even then you only had to buy it once. Subscriptions never ended, which led to DLC, which led to in-game stores, which paved the way for microtransactions, which led to seasons, which ignited the pre-order bonus online culture where you can pay $20 more to play a game a week before everyone else, which has led to us changing the way game progression systems are now designed, which brings you up to today, where you're never really sure if you're getting everything you should be when you fork over the money. Step back and look at modern gaming from a peanut gallery and you'll see the monetization buffet feasting on an industry driven by big business, that's for sure. But when you bought a game in the 2000s, you pretty much got the whole game. WoW had a subscription, but there was never a moment where you questioned the ethics of its content. WoW was generous and large. It wasn't selling boosters or max level characters or cosmetics in the store. And content wasn't ripped out of the base game to use as DLC. At least it didn't seem like that, and that goes for basically every other game I played. I never got the suspicion that games were being chopped up behind the scenes. Finding a game, especially on the console, ransacked with in-game monetization was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Games may have been shitty, but if you bought a game, you were getting the full package. A lot of people tend to look back and say that older games were better, but if you actually lived through the 2000s, you'd find tons of crappy games, just like today. They were more feature completes, but I could show you 100 bad games from this decade. But you only need to look at something like Simpsons Wrestling or Batman Dark Tomorrow. Anyone could tell just from this footage that these games are diarrhea city. But it wasn't just these games, there were tons of issues across all genres, terrible movie adaptations, horrible ports given the variance of new PC hardware, and lots of control issues. When you have an era of innovation, there are always going to be a bunch of turds floating around. And you have to remember that refunding games wasn't as available as it is today. There weren't Steam refunds, and if you opened a box at your store, you probably wouldn't get back what you paid for it. Hell, one time, Walmart made me open the copy of Superman 64 I brought back to return and plug it into their display unit and show them my save file just so they could see if I had played the game. I felt so embarrassed because I did play the game, I just wanted to return it because it was shit. There was a lot of risk playing games, no doubts, and a lot of rental stores had limited copies of games. My local video store never had copies of new games. Some lowlife would always get there before me, so I had to rely on rare game demo CDs that would sometimes come with new editions of EGM. Though honestly, game magazines and rentals wouldn't be that big of a part of game culture as the decade closed out. Netflix and Redbox would put so much pressure on the brick and mortar that they'd be driven out of business just a few years after the 2000s ended. As the sun of the 2000s began to set, games were in a completely different spot than when it started. The seventh generation consoles were getting mature, and all the big companies were getting ready to release their next systems in the coming years. Systems like the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 now had wireless controls, online functionality, and new tech like Blu-ray players or motion controls or tilt features. Ventrilo was founded and Steam was making headway, so you could now buy games online and voice chat with all of your friends. Advances in presentation were making games incredibly atmospheric, even movie-like. Iconic titles like Killzone 2 and Uncharted 2 featured beautiful on-rails technology that were some of the first real-time set pieces that I ever experienced. It was now possible to retain control while games came alive in the background, territory once reserved for pre-rendered cutscenes, and a huge leap forward from missions like Stalingrad from Call of Duty 1 just a few years beforehand. Smartphones were gaining momentum, the mobile gaming crave was about to take the world by storm. And gaming had changed. RPGs were getting huge, worlds were becoming open, and sequels were becoming a big thing too. All around the world people were playing games, at home, online, and in trains going to and from work. In the following decade, games would become so mainstream that you'd no longer be an outcast, leading to even more popularity as streaming platforms would burst onto the scene and once again change the face of gaming forever. There's no denying that the 2000s were, with the 90s, the two most defining decades in all of gaming. No other period of 20 years would see so much change and transform our culture, its people, how accepted we were, and how we played, shared, and experienced games. It was a time where video games thrived in so many creative ways and where people took a chance on an idea, even though they didn't know if it would work out. Creating a breathtaking handful of years where games were made through passion creation rather than profit creation, before games became the commodities that they are today, and gaming culture became what it is now. Every era has its ups and downs, and modern gaming has given us some incredible titles, but it's also changed so much of the heart of game development that it feels very estranged from this period. The 90s and the 2000s were simple times where gaming was pure bliss. I carried gaming with me through high school and into college, through my entire life, and through all the changes of video game genres and gimmicks and fads. There were so many beloved titles, and I had so many wonderful memories during this time, playing by myself, with my old friends, and with all the new people I met in the online scene. There were so many memories that it was impossible to show them all in this one video, and that's a sign that the 2000s was where gaming might have been at its best. Thanks for watching. If you have a story to share about your experience in the 2000s, please feel free to post it in the comment section below. I'll see you guys in our next video. Peace.